My name is Isla. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, people have described me the same way. Gentle, dependable, soft-spoken. The kind of woman who remembers birthdays without reminders. The kind who stays late without being asked. The kind who doesn't argue. If you met me a few years ago, you would have seen someone who walked carefully through rooms, as if afraid to take up too much space. I was the quieter sibling, the accommodating daughter, the granddaughter who never asked for anything, especially not attention. And then one day, I lost my sight. Officially, it was a car accident. A tragic, mistimed collision on a narrow country road just weeks before my grandfather finalized changes to his will. My brother was driving. The report called it unfortunate, unavoidable. One of those cruel twists of fate that rearrange families overnight. What no one knew at the time, what I didn't know for an entire year, was that it had been staged. My brother staged a car accident that blinded me so he could take over my grandfather's inheritance. For 12 months, I lived in darkness. Not just physical darkness, but the kind that changes how people speak around you. How do they make decisions for you? How they quietly reassign your future. I learned how to count steps between rooms, how to measure a cup of tea by touch, how to recognize silence when it stretches just a little too long. And then one night, in what he thought was privacy, I overheard him laughing with the getaway driver about how easy it had been to break me. That sentence did not shatter me. It clarified me. This is not a story about revenge. There are no screaming confrontations, no dramatic courtroom confessions, no cinematic justice. I won't offer you villains with twisted mustaches or sudden miracles that restore what was taken. This is a story about patience, about how silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes something different, about how being underestimated can become leverage. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you exactly how it unfolded, who I was before the accident, how my family shifted around me afterward, what I began to notice once everyone believed I couldn't see, and the decisions I made once I understood the truth. I won't dramatize it. I won't exaggerate it. I'll tell you what I felt, what I learned, and what changed. Because sometimes the loudest power is the one that never raises its voice. And sometimes the person you thought was broken is the only one who is paying attention. Have you ever realized too late that someone mistook your kindness for weakness? Before the accident, I was the stable one. That's how my family described me. Stable. Not brilliant like my brother Callum. Not ambitious, not magnetic, just steady. Callum was 2 years older and moved through life as if it were already applauding him. He had a way of speaking that filled rooms. Even when he was wrong, he sounded certain. Especially when he was wrong. I, on the other hand, learned early that certainty wasn't always rewarded in women. So I chose precision instead. I worked quietly at the Holborn Museum in Bath, restoring small oil paintings no one else had patience for. I could spend 3 hours correcting a crack in varnish the width of a hairline. I liked that kind of work. Invisible improvements, subtle restorations, things that didn't demand recognition to matter. At family gatherings, I poured wine. I cleared plates. I asked follow-up questions about other people's promotions. Callum told stories. My grandfather noticed this difference, though he never commented directly. He would sit beside me after dinner, his hand resting on the carved wooden head of his cane, and ask what I was working on. Not in a polite way, in a detailed way. What did you discover under the second layer? He'd ask. He knew I looked deeper. The inheritance was never openly discussed. That's important. There was no dramatic reading of percentages or whispered promises. But my grandfather had built a modest property portfolio over decades, rental flats in Bristol, 2 commercial units, and the townhouse we grew up visiting every Christmas. Callum assumed most of it would go to him. He never said that outright either. But assumptions have texture. You can feel it in how someone speaks about the future as if it already belongs to them. I was never positioned as competition. When I bought my small flat near the canal, my mother said, "It's lovely, Isla. Sensible. You've always been good at managing with less." Managing with less. It wasn't cruel. It was observational. And that made it harder to protest. Callum once joked at dinner, "If the world collapses, Isla will still have her spreadsheets." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because it wasn't wrong. I did have spreadsheets, rental income projections, restoration budgets, contingency funds. I helped my grandfather organize his paperwork when his eyesight began to fade slightly with age. I knew where every document was kept. I knew which solicitor he preferred and why he distrusted the other. But in the family narrative, I was the assistant, the helper, the dependable background. Callum was the future. No one ever said I was weak. They simply behaved as if I posed no threat. And here's the quiet truth. I accepted that role for a long time. It was easier to be underestimated than to be challenged. Easier to move without resistance. What I didn't understand then was how dangerous invisibility becomes when someone ambitious decides you're in the way. Because to them, I wasn't a rival. I was an obstacle that could be gently removed. And when the accident happened, when metal screamed and glass fractured and my world went dark, the narrative shifted instantly. Poor Isla. Unlucky Isla, fragile Isla. Callum stepped forward seamlessly, handling paperwork, speaking to solicitors, comforting our mother, explaining things on my behalf. He looked like a hero, and I looked like someone who would never again manage more than her own recovery. They thought the story had simplified. They thought my role had shrunk. What they didn't understand was this. Losing sight does not mean losing awareness. And sometimes when the world goes dark, you begin to hear everything. The first small cut didn't come with the accident. It came after. In the beginning, everything was wrapped in softness. Doctors spoke in careful tones. My mother held my hands, as if they might disappear. Callum stayed close, too close, answering questions before I could finish asking them. "It's better if she rests," he would say gently when visitors lingered. "She doesn't need to worry about paperwork right now," he'd add when my grandfather asked about the estate review we had scheduled. At the time, it felt protective. I was adjusting to a world without light. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted flowers. Machines hummed, time blurred. I relied on voices to anchor myself. Callum's voice became constant. He described things I couldn't see. The weather, the color of the sky at sunset, the way our grandfather looked when he visited. Tired, but strong, he would say. But then, one afternoon, I noticed something small, a pause. Our grandfather had come alone that day. I could tell by the uneven rhythm of his cane against the hospital tile. He pulled his chair close to my bed, and for a few minutes, we spoke quietly about nothing. Tea brands, the museum, and whether the conservators were keeping my projects in stable humidity. Then he cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he began slowly, "we should still review the documents next month. No need to delay these things." I felt relief at the familiarity of it, the structure, the order. "Yes," I said, "we can—" "She won't be able to handle that, Granddad." Callum's interruption was smooth, almost affectionate. "She needs to focus on recovery. The solicitor and I can sort through the technical details." Technical details. As if I hadn't organized those same files for 3 years. There was a silence. A small one. The kind most people don't register. But I heard it. My grandfather shifted in his seat. His cane tapped once against the floor. "I see," he said. It wasn't an agreement, it was uncertainty. I opened my mouth to speak, to clarify that I was still capable, that blindness hadn't dissolved my literacy or memory. But Callum's hand closed around mine. A gentle squeeze. "Don't strain yourself," he murmured. Everyone in the room interpreted that gesture as kindness. I felt it differently. It was the first time I understood something subtle. I was being edited out of conversations I used to lead. Later that evening, when we were alone, I asked him, "Why did you say I couldn't handle it?" His response was immediate. "Isla, come on. You've just lost your sight. You can't possibly want to read through property contracts right now." "I don't need to read them," I said quietly. "I know them." He exhaled a soft laugh under his breath. "You're being stubborn. Let me take care of things for once." For once, as if I had never been taking care of them already. It was a small cut, dismissed by anyone else as reasonable, even loving. But it stayed with me, because it wasn't about the documents. It was about repositioning. The narrative shifted subtly from Isla manages the details to Isla must be managed. And once a role changes in a family, it rarely shifts back on its own. Over the next few weeks, similar moments followed. Mail redirected through Callum. Phone calls answered before they reached me. Updates are summarized instead of shared. Each one is explainable. Each one is defensible. Each one is tiny enough that protesting would make me seem ungrateful. So I didn't protest. I listened. And I began to realize something uncomfortable. When you remove someone's sight, people assume you've removed their oversight too. That was the first mistake. If the first cut was subtle, the repetition was what made it permanent. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as efficiency, as a concern, as practicality. Within a month of leaving the hospital, my life had been reorganized. Without my permission, but with everyone insisting it was for the best. Callum moved temporarily into my flat, not because I asked, because, as he explained to our mother, she can't manage alone yet. The word yet did a lot of work in that sentence. It implied patience. It implied progress. It implied that control was temporary. I told myself the same thing. He rearranged the kitchen to make things safer. He labeled cupboards and raised lettering. He installed voice-activated systems I hadn't requested. Every change came wrapped in helpfulness. But gradually, decisions stopped being discussed. One afternoon, I reached for the folder where I kept copies of our grandfather's rental agreements. It wasn't on the shelf. "Where did you put the blue archive binder?" I asked. "I moved it," Callum replied from the living room. "Where?" "With the rest of Granddad's paperwork. It makes more sense for me to handle it now." Now. It was always now, never temporary. I stood there longer than necessary, my fingers resting against empty wood. I could feel the shape of absence, the space where something used to be. "You could have told me," I said. "I didn't think it mattered. That was the shift. I didn't mean to upset you. Not I forgot. It doesn't matter. When someone decides your input no longer affects outcomes, they stop informing you. They summarize. They filter. They reduce." At family dinners, the pattern solidified. Relatives lowered their voices when speaking to me, as if blindness required softness. They asked Callum logistical questions about the properties, even though I had managed the spreadsheets for years. He answered easily, confidently, correctly, most of the time. When he made small errors, confusing rental timelines, misstating repair costs, I noticed. I always noticed. But correcting him in front of others would have felt disruptive, and I had already been recast as fragile. Fragile people don't contradict, so I stayed quiet. I told myself it was temporary, that grief and crisis distort roles, that once I adjusted fully, I would reclaim my place. But the truth is more uncomfortable. Part of me rationalized the silence because it felt easier than resistance. Challenging him would mean acknowledging something darker, that his helpfulness was selective, strategic. It was easier to believe he was overcompensating than to consider he was consolidating. Meanwhile, paperwork began to flow exclusively through him. "I'll update Idla," he'd say on calls. Update, as if I were a stakeholder, not a co-manager. The solicitor started addressing emails solely to Callum. When I asked about it, he said gently, "I thought it would reduce stress for you." Reduce stress. I began to hear how language can slowly erase someone. No single moment justified outrage, but the accumulation built weight. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, memorizing the room's acoustics, mapping sound to space, I realized something unsettling. No one was actively trying to hurt me. They were simply adjusting to the version of me that required less consideration. And I had allowed that adjustment because I didn't want to seem ungrateful, because I didn't want to create tension while everyone believed I was already suffering enough. But silence, when repeated, becomes permission, and permission, when granted long enough, becomes precedent. They weren't testing whether I would object anymore. They had concluded I wouldn't. That was the moment I understood. Disrespect doesn't grow because someone is cruel. It grows because someone else decides not to interrupt it. And I had not interrupted it. Not yet. There's a moment in every quiet shift where you realize the script has been rewritten. Not dramatically, not with an announcement, just adjusted. By early autumn, my role in the family had settled into something unmistakable. I was the brave one, the inspirational one, the one who had been through so much. At first, those labels sounded compassionate. People admired resilience. They praised how well I was coping. But admiration can also be containment. When someone praises your strength in surviving loss, they rarely imagine you as someone who still exercises power. At Sunday lunches, relatives squeezed my hand and said, "You're so strong, Isla." And then they turned to Callum to discuss lease renewals and property valuations. Strength, apparently, did not extend to decision-making. One afternoon, I overheard my mother speaking to a neighbor in the kitchen. "It's such a shame," she whispered. "She was always so organized, so capable. But now, well, at least Callum stepped up. Stepped up, as if I had stepped down. I sat at the dining table, tracing the grain of the wood with my fingertips, and felt something steady settle inside me. This wasn't temporary. This was structural. The role assigned to me was clear. Be grateful. Be brave. Be dependent. And above all, be quiet. I wasn't expected to object. Objection would disrupt the narrative of recovery that everyone found comforting. Callum leaned into his new position effortlessly. He updated the extended family on Josh, how things were going. He made minor renovations to one of the rental flats without consulting me. When I asked about the expense, he said, "Trust me, it's handled. Trust me, it's handled." Those phrases became familiar refrains. The strange thing is, he never sounded malicious. He sounded reasonable, responsible, which made it harder to articulate what felt wrong, because nothing looked wrong from the outside. My grandfather grew quieter during this period. Age had slowed him, but his mind remained sharp. When he visited, he still asked me precise questions. "What yield are we getting on the Clifton property now?" he asked once. Before I could answer, Callum replied, "It's stable. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." I noticed my grandfather didn't respond immediately. His cane tapped once against the floor, a habit he had when thinking. Later, when Callum stepped outside to take a call, my grandfather leaned closer. "You still keeping track of everything?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. It was the first direct acknowledgement that he understood. "I thought so," he murmured. That small exchange did something important. It reminded me that being assigned a role doesn't mean accepting it internally. Externally, I allowed the performance to continue. I let Callum speak. I let relatives assume. I let the solicitor correspond through him. Because I was beginning to understand something subtle but powerful. The more comfortable they became underestimating me, the less carefully they would move. And I was no longer reacting emotionally. I was observing, mapping patterns, tracking inconsistencies. If they believed I was fragile, they would not guard their conversations. If they believed I was dependent, they would not monitor what I requested access to. The role they assigned me, reliable, useful, invisible, had one advantage. Invisible people are rarely watched. And when no one is watching you, you are free to watch them. The shift didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no argument, no accusation, no sudden revelation. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, almost 6 months after the accident. I had begun mobility training by then. I could navigate from my flat to the corner shop with a cane. I knew the texture of each pavement crack. I knew which doorway echoed slightly differently because of its recessed frame. I knew how to count traffic patterns by sound. Independence, when rebuilt slowly, becomes deliberate. That day, I returned home earlier than Callum expected. I could tell by the way his voice changed when I unlocked the door. He was on the phone. "Yes, but if it's finalized before the year closes, it simplifies things." A pause. No, she won't contest it. Another pause. "I told you, she's focused on recovery. She doesn't even want to think about paperwork." He hadn't heard me enter. I stood still in the hallway, not moving toward the sound. Not interrupting, just listening. "Granddad trusts me," he continued. "He knows I'm better suited to manage it long term." Better suited. There was no anger in his tone, only certainty. That certainty settled something inside me. Until that moment, part of me had still clung to the idea that this was overprotection. Misguided, perhaps, but rooted in care. But there is a difference between protecting someone and replacing them. Callum wasn't managing logistics temporarily. He was narrating to me out of relevance. I walked deliberately into the living room, allowing my cane to tap against the floor. He ended the call too quickly. "Everything all right?" he asked, voice light. "Yes," I said evenly. "Just back from training." He filled the silence with details about dinner plans, errands, normal things. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask who he was speaking to. Instead, I went into my bedroom and closed the door. That was the moment something internal aligned. Not anger, clarity. For months, I had been adjusting to blindness, learning new systems, rebuilding confidence, accepting help where needed. But I had not yet recalibrated my position. That afternoon, I stopped waiting for things to return to normal. Normal had shifted. If I wanted agency, I would have to claim it deliberately. Not loudly, not emotionally, but structurally. I sat on the edge of my bed and ran my fingers along the brass fountain pen my grandfather had given me years earlier. I kept it on my bedside table more out of sentiment than use. He once told me, "Ink is quieter than speech, but it lasts longer." I finally understood what that meant. Callum believed I wouldn't contest changes because I appeared passive. The solicitor believed correspondence through him reduced my stress. My mother believed I needed shielding. All of them were operating on assumptions I had allowed. The shift was simple. I would stop correcting them verbally and start repositioning myself practically. Silence would no longer be avoidance. It would be a strategy. That night at dinner, Callum spoke about future renovation plans for one of the Bristol flats. He described potential profit increases, timelines, and tax advantages. I listened, I asked neutral questions. "How are you calculating the depreciation?" I inquired softly. He answered confidently, but inaccurately. I noted it, not to embarrass him, not to challenge him, just to confirm something. He was moving quickly, and quick movement creates errors. For the first time since the accident, I didn't feel displaced. I felt patient. The difference between being pushed aside and stepping back voluntarily is subtle, but it changes everything, because once you step back by choice, you can choose when to step forward again. And I had just decided that I would. After that Tuesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been defensive, a way to avoid conflict, a way to preserve peace in a house already strained by circumstance. Now it was deliberate. There is a difference between not speaking because you feel small and not speaking because you are listening. I began to refine what I listened for. Callum assumed my world had narrowed to tactile maps and audio cues. He underestimated how acute attention becomes when sight is removed. Tone sharpened, breath patterns mattered. The rhythm of footsteps told stories. I could tell when he was confident. I could tell when he was improvising. I could tell when he was lying. He took more calls in the living room now. He didn't lower his voice as often. The narrative of my fragility had convinced him I was focused inward, on recovery, on adjustment. He forgot I had always been good with patterns. One evening, I heard him discussing a valuation review for one of the commercial units. The numbers sounded inflated. Not wildly, just slightly, enough to justify a restructuring, enough to make a decision seem urgent. After he ended the call, I asked lightly, "Did the property appreciate that quickly?" He hesitated, a fraction too long. "Market's volatile," he said. "Things move fast." "Of course," I replied. I didn't argue, because the argument would alert him. Instead, I requested something practical the next morning. "I'd like digital copies of all updated valuations," I said over breakfast. "Audio compatible. It will help me stay mentally engaged." It was framed as therapeutic. He couldn't refuse without appearing obstructive. He agreed, though. I heard reluctance in the way his fork touched the plate, slightly sharper than usual. Silence, when chosen strategically, invites disclosure. Over the next few weeks, I asked for small, reasonable accommodations, access to shared financial dashboards, inclusion on solicitor calls for stimulation, clarifications on timelines so I could follow along. Each request sounded harmless. Each one widened my visibility again. Callum complied because denying me would contradict the image he had constructed, the devoted brother managing everything transparently. Meanwhile, I rebuilt something quietly. Routine. I scheduled weekly reviews with screen reading software. I memorized figures. I dictated notes into secure audio files, time-stamped and categorized. I didn't accuse. I documented. The more comfortable he became, the more relaxed his language grew. "She won't question it," he once said on a call, unaware I had entered the room silently. "She trusts me." Trust is a powerful assumption. It reduces caution. But trust, once misplaced, becomes leverage. I noticed another change, too. My grandfather began calling me directly again. Not frequently, just enough. "Everything in order?" he would ask. "Yes," I would answer, "everything documented." He never pressed further. He didn't need to. Silence between two people who understand each other doesn't require explanation. Callum mistook my calm for resignation. My mother mistook it for acceptance. The extended family mistook it for healing. None of them realized silence had become a position of strength. Because when you are underestimated, people speak freely in front of you. When you are considered harmless, they do not guard their inconsistencies. And when they believe you are dependent, they do not anticipate resistance. I was no longer trying to reclaim the role I once held. I was building a new one they would not recognize until it was already established. Silence, I learned, is most powerful when others believe it belongs to them. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like recovery. It looks like a woman rebuilding her life carefully after a loss. That's what they saw. What they didn't see was structure forming underneath. I began with something simple: access. Callum had centralized communication, but not perfectly. He was efficient, not meticulous, and efficiency leaves traces. Through the museum, I still had a trusted colleague, Mara, who specialized in archival digitization. She thought she was helping me practice adaptive software when I asked her to walk me through encrypted cloud storage systems. She never asked why I wanted separate backups. She assumed it was about independence. In a way, it was. I requested full audio transcripts of every solicitor call moving forward, citing accessibility requirements. It was framed as compliance, not suspicion, not, no one could argue against accessibility. The transcripts arrived automatically within days. And transcripts are honest in a way memory isn't. You can hear hesitations. Interruptions. Who speaks over whom? Who answers questions that weren't directed at them? I cataloged everything. Dates. Valuations. Proposed amendments to the estate structure. Callum had initiated discussions about consolidating management authority under his name to streamline long-term administration. The language sounded responsible, but the timing was interesting. Every proposal followed moments when my grandfather appeared physically tired. Every restructuring suggestion emphasized urgency. Every explanation minimized my involvement without explicitly excluding me. Subtle, defensible, strategic. I also began mobility sessions in areas I hadn't previously visited alone, particularly near the Bristol properties. I hired an orientation specialist under the guise of confidence building. In truth, I wanted familiarity. If I ever needed to move independently in those spaces, I would. People assume blindness confines you. It doesn't. It forces you to map differently. Meanwhile, I noticed inconsistencies in expense reports, small discrepancies in renovation invoices, not dramatic sums, not criminal-looking numbers, but enough to suggest something was being redirected or misrepresented. I didn't jump to conclusions. I verified. I requested original contractor quotes directly from companies, explaining that I was studying cost trends as part of my cognitive rehabilitation. The phrasing disarmed suspicion. Contractors are practical people. They sent copies without hesitation. The numbers didn't align. Still, I did nothing publicly. Preparation requires emotional neutrality. Anger makes you premature. Clarity makes you precise. Then came the detail that changed everything. One evening, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic. I walked toward the kitchen for water, moving carefully without my cane. Callum was outside on the balcony. He thought he was alone. "I told you," he said softly into his phone, a faint laugh in his voice. "She's not the same anymore." A pause. "No, she won't dig. She wouldn't even know where to start." He exhaled again, amused. It was easier than I expected. There was something in that sentence that didn't align with finances. Easier than expected. Not smoother. Not simpler. Easier. And then, a phrase that made my spine go still. The accident solved everything. Solved. Not changed. Not complicated. Solved. He lowered his voice after that. I stepped back before I could catch more, but I didn't need the rest. Up until then, I had suspected opportunism, ambition exploiting circumstance. Now a darker possibility emerged. I didn't confront him. I didn't react. I returned to bed and lay awake until morning. Preparation shifted from financial documentation to something deeper. Intent. Because if the accident had solved something for him, then it hadn't been random. And if it hadn't been random, then everything I had tolerated so far was not a misjudgment. It was designed, and design leaves patterns. Patterns leave proof. They still believed I was rebuilding my confidence. They still believed I was focused on adaptation. What they never noticed was this. I was no longer documenting mismanagement. I was investigating motive. Quietly, carefully, irreversibly. Clarity rarely arrives all at once. It gathers, layer by layer, tone by tone, until one detail locks into place and the entire pattern sharpens. For months after that balcony call, I said nothing. I didn't change my routine. I didn't distance myself from Callum. If anything, I became slightly warmer, slightly more trusting. Predictability relaxes people, and relaxed people forget to edit themselves. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. A winter evening, nearly a year since the accident. We were at my grandfather's townhouse for dinner. The house always carried a distinct scent, polished wood and old books. Even blind, I could feel the difference in air pressure between its high ceilings and my small flat. After dessert, I excused myself early, claiming fatigue. I knew the layout intimately from childhood. I moved toward the upstairs guest room, but paused halfway up the staircase. Voices carried differently there. Callum's voice, and another male voice I didn't recognize. Lower, rougher. They were in my grandfather's study. The door wasn't fully closed. "I told you," Callum was saying, laughing quietly. She believed it was just bad luck. The other man chuckled. "You should have seen your face that day," he replied. "I thought you were going to panic." "Nah," Callum said. "Everything went exactly how it needed to." Exactly how it needed to. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. The other man continued. "Still can't believe you got away with it. A staged skid on wet gravel? Risky." There it was. Not implication. Not suspicion. Explicit. Callum exhaled again. Comfortable. Almost proud. "She was always the cautious one," he said. "Always triple-checking everything. But break one thing she relies on, and the rest falls into place." Break one thing. The room felt very still. For a moment, I experienced something I hadn't allowed myself before. Grief without confusion. Not for my sight. For the person I thought my brother was. The other man spoke again. And now? Now? Callum's tone shifted to amusement. Now she's dependent. Granddad updated the structure exactly like we planned. Consolidated management authority. I just had to make sure she looked incapable long enough. I didn't stay to hear more. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I had heard enough. I moved quietly back down the stairs and into the sitting room. My breathing controlled, my steps measured. There was no dramatic internal collapse, only confirmation. The accident hadn't been a miscalculation. It had been orchestrated. The leverage I discovered in that moment wasn't emotional. It was structural. Because the one mistake people make when they believe you are broken is this. They confess in proximity. They assume you cannot piece together what you cannot see. But sight is only one form of awareness. And I had a year's worth of documentation, transcripts, financial discrepancies, timeline correlations, and now admission, not recorded, not yet, but identifiable, memorable, precise. I returned to the guest room and closed the door softly. I sat on the edge of the bed and ran my fingers along the brass fountain pen in my coat pocket. My grandfather had once told me something else. When someone shows you their design, Isla, don't interrupt it. Let them complete it. Incomplete plans are hard to prove. Finished ones are undeniable. Callum believed he had finished his design. He believed the narrative was stable. He believed I was incapable of repositioning. That was his final miscalculation. I didn't feel rage. I felt alignment. Because from that moment forward, I was no longer responding to subtle disrespect or opportunism. I was responding to intent. And intent requires precision. There would be no public accusation, no emotional confrontation, no reactive move. Only one decision left. What outcome did I want? Not for revenge, for permanence. When betrayal becomes undeniable, the first instinct is exposure, to confront, to force confession into the open air and demand explanation. I considered it. In the quiet of that guest room, I walked through every possible version of confrontation in my mind. I imagined stepping into the study, interrupting their laughter, speaking the words plainly. I heard you. I imagined the shock, the scrambling, the denial, because men like Callum don't confess twice. If I confronted him without evidence secured, he would retreat into performance. He would shift from arrogance to injured innocence. He would remind everyone of the trauma I had endured. He would position me as emotionally unstable, and perhaps, without documentation, he would succeed. That was the first option, immediate confrontation. It would satisfy anger. It would achieve nothing. The second option was withdrawal. I could distance myself quietly, remove my involvement entirely, allow him to inherit whatever he believed he had secured, build a separate life detached from the family structure. That option offered peace, but not integrity. Because if he had orchestrated my blindness to consolidate control, then stepping away would validate the design. The third option required patience, not just to protect myself, but to protect my grandfather. Because the real vulnerability in this situation wasn't me. It was him, an aging man who trusted his grandson's competence, a man who believed structural changes to his estate were being made for efficiency, not manipulation. If I acted emotionally, I risked destabilizing him without proof. If I acted prematurely, I risked being dismissed. So I asked myself one clarifying question. What outcome ensures this never happens again, to me or anyone else? Not humiliation, not revenge, permanence. Callum had consolidated management authority, but the estate itself was still under my grandfather's legal control. And my grandfather valued two things above all: order, evidence. I decided then I would not expose Callum directly. I would restructure the structure. Instead of fighting him inside the system he believed he controlled, I would alter the system itself. That meant 3 irreversible moves. Secure admissible proof. Reestablish direct legal alignment with my grandfather. Redesign the inheritance framework beyond Callum's reach. No accusations. No dramatic scenes. Just architecture. The most powerful changes are invisible until they are finalized. That night, I returned downstairs when the house had settled. I spoke normally, ate lightly, smiled when appropriate. Callum sounded relaxed, unthreatened. He believed the hardest part of his plan had already succeeded. He didn't realize that the true decision point hadn't been the accident. It was this moment, the moment I chose not to react. When someone underestimates you, they prepare for noise. They don't prepare for redesign. By the time Callum understood what I had chosen, the system would already be closed. And systems, once finalized, are not emotional. They are enforceable. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. Emotion had served its purpose. It clarified the motive. It sharpened my focus. But it had no place in execution. The first step was proof. I couldn't rely on memory alone, no matter how precise. What I had overheard in the study confirmed intent. but confirmation is not evidence. So I recreated the opportunity, carefully. Over the following weeks, I shifted my behavior in subtle ways. I asked Callum for more help than usual. I deferred to him publicly in front of our grandfather. "You've handled everything so well," I told him once at dinner. Praise disarms the ego. Ego invites repetition. Eventually, he relaxed enough to revisit the subject, though not directly. One evening, back at my flat, he took a call on speaker in the kitchen, while I sat in the adjoining room with my accessibility software active. He assumed I was reviewing audio articles. I wasn't. I had placed my phone on record hours earlier, not hidden, just present. A device in a room where devices are common. "No, it's airtight," he was saying. A pause. She never suspected anything. Honestly, after the accident, she barely questioned me. The other voice, the same rough tone from the study, laughed. "Still wild you pulled that off." "Relax," Callum replied. "It's done. No one's reopening it." There it was again. Not an apology. Not regret. Confidence. That recording was enough to justify the next step. The second move required precision and discretion. I requested a private meeting with my grandfather's long-standing solicitor, Mr. Hale, under the pretense of discussing accessibility accommodations for estate communication. I insisted on attending alone. Callum protested gently. "It's a lot for you to manage solo." "I'd like to try," I said calmly. He couldn't object without undermining the narrative he had constructed about supporting my independence. Mr. Hale met me in a quiet office with thick carpeting and controlled acoustics. I had been there before, years ago, organizing files for my grandfather. "I'd like to review the current estate structure personally," I began. He hesitated. "Your brother has been managing." "I know," I said evenly. "But I'd like to confirm my understanding." Over the next hour, I asked precise questions, not accusatory ones, structural ones. Authority consolidation clauses, amendment dates, signature sequencing. Mr. Hale answered carefully. He sensed something had shifted, though I never named it. Before leaving, I placed a small encrypted drive on the table. "I need this reviewed discreetly," I said. He did not ask what it contained. He simply nodded. The third move unfolded over the next month. Independent forensic review of the accident report, financial audit of renovation invoices, and most importantly, a private, unhurried conversation with my grandfather. Not about betrayal, about legacy. "I want to ensure your work is protected long-term," I told him one afternoon as we sat in his study, protected from mistakes, from overconfidence, from risk. He listened. He asked measured questions, and slowly, without ever naming Callum, we redesigned the estate framework. Shared authority replaced singular management. Oversight mechanisms were formalized. Automatic audits embedded. Contingency clauses are activated if misconduct were ever substantiated. Everything documented. Everything signed. Callum remained unaware. He continued speaking confidently about future plans. He didn't notice that access privileges were quietly recalibrated, that certain signatures are now required for dual authorization, that financial transparency protocols had tightened. Silence protected the transition. By the time the structural changes were finalized, there was nothing emotional left to argue about. No dramatic accusation, no confrontation, just a system that no longer depended on his honesty. And systems, once amended, do not require consent from those who assumed control. Consequences, when designed properly, don't arrive with sirens. They arrive as friction, small disruptions at first, delays, questions, procedures that suddenly require clarification. Callum noticed the first shift during a routine transaction. He was restructuring a lease agreement for one of the Bristol commercial units, something he had done before without resistance. But this time, the bank flagged the transfer. Dual authorization required, they informed him. He laughed when he told me about it that evening. "Some new compliance nonsense," he said lightly. "I'll sort it." I stirred my tea slowly. "That sounds reasonable," I replied. "Transparency protects everyone." He went quiet for half a second. Not long enough for anyone else to register. Long enough for me. Over the next week, similar interruptions followed. The solicitor requested additional documentation before approving a property adjustment. An independent auditor reached out to verify renovation invoices. Mr. Hale scheduled quarterly review meetings as part of the updated governance framework. Callum began using words like bureaucratic and inefficient. He framed the changes as overcomplication, but he couldn't challenge them openly without questioning our grandfather's judgment. And our grandfather presented the revisions calmly. "I realized we should modernize the structure," he said at dinner one evening. "Good governance matters." Callum responded with a controlled smile. Of course. He still believed he could navigate around it. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that the recording had already been reviewed. Forensic analysis of the accident had quietly reopened under civil counsel. Not publicly, discreetly. The original skid assessment showed irregular braking patterns inconsistent with a panic response. Nothing explosive, but enough to raise an inquiry. Meanwhile, the financial audit uncovered invoice discrepancies that required explanation. Again, nothing theatrical. Just inconsistencies that needed reconciliation. Consequences rarely shout. They accumulate. Callum's tone shifted subtly in the following weeks. Less amused, more guarded. He started taking calls outside again, lowering his voice. One night, he asked me unexpectedly, "Have you noticed how complicated things have become?" I tilted my head slightly. In what sense? All these reviews, the audits. It's like someone doesn't trust the system. I let a small silence settle. Systems should withstand scrutiny, I said gently, if they're solid. He exhaled. Frustration flickered beneath composure, but he still didn't suspect me, because in his mind, I was adjusting to independence, not orchestrating oversight. Our grandfather appeared thoughtful during this period. Observant. He never confronted Callum directly. He didn't need to. The new structure spoke for itself, and structures reveal character. When access tightens, integrity either stabilizes or strains. Callum began working longer hours, attempting to reconcile inconsistencies, explaining minor administrative oversights, clarifying timelines. The getaway driver, the man from the study, stopped visiting the townhouse entirely. Distance is often the first instinct when exposure becomes possible, but by then, the architecture was already in place. If misconduct surfaced, clauses would activate automatically. Authority would be redistributed. Assets would be protected. Callum didn't lose everything at once. He lost ease. He lost unquestioned control. He lost the comfort of operating unseen. And perhaps most unsettling for him, he began to realize someone had been paying attention. He just didn't know who. Panic rarely looks dramatic at first. It looks like overcorrection. Callum started double-checking everything aloud, explaining decisions no one had questioned, offering unsolicited transparency. "Just so everyone's clear," he said one Sunday afternoon, spreading documents across the dining table. The renovation variance was due to supplier delays. Completely normal. No one had accused him of anything, yet he was defending himself. Our grandfather listened quietly, his fingers resting on the carved head of his cane. "Of course," he said. "That's why documentation exists." Documentation. The word lingered. Within weeks, the external review of the accident file produced something subtle but destabilizing. The civil consultant identified inconsistencies between Callum's original statement and the vehicle's telemetry report. Not enough for criminal proceedings, but enough to justify formal questioning. When Mr. Hale informed Callum that clarification would be required as a matter of due diligence, I heard the change in his breathing from across the room. "That's unnecessary," he said carefully. "It was ruled accidental." "Yes," Mr. Hale replied evenly, "but governance adjustments require comprehensive transparency." Transparency, the very concept Callum had once minimized. He tried to regain his footing by appealing emotionally. To me, one evening he entered my flat later than usual. His movements were sharper, less measured. "Do you feel like something's happening?" he asked. I sat at the kitchen table, fingers resting lightly around a mug. "Something like what?" Like people are questioning things, old things." I kept my tone neutral. "If everything was handled properly, there's nothing to worry about." The silence that followed was longer than any we'd shared before. He wanted reassurance. He wanted me to play the fragile role again, to affirm that I trusted him unquestioningly. I didn't offer it. Over the next month, financial access tightened further under the revised estate clauses. Temporary freezes were placed on discretionary adjustments pending audit resolution. Callum's control wasn't revoked publicly. It was suspended procedurally, which is harder to argue against. Our grandfather requested a private meeting with both of us in his study. I recognized the scent of polished oak and paper as we sat down. He spoke calmly. "I've updated the will again," he said. "Shared trusteeship, independent oversight. Certain contingencies have been activated." Callum inhaled sharply. "Why?" "Because legacy requires resilience," our grandfather replied. "No accusations, no raised voices, just a structural consequence." Callum tried to salvage authority through logic. "This is overcautious. You're complicating things." "Perhaps," our grandfather said softly, "but caution preserves what confidence sometimes risks." That sentence ended the discussion. After that evening, something shifted irreversibly. Callum stopped laughing easily. He stopped narrating future plans with certainty. He began consulting lawyers, not defensively, but preemptively. Too late, because by then, documentation was archived, audit trails secured, telematics reports appended, independent trustees assigned. Systems once centralized had been redistributed beyond his reach. And perhaps most final of all, Our grandfather amended a personal letter of intent detailing his expectations for ethical stewardship. Signed, witnessed, filed. Callum had orchestrated a single moment, a staged accident, to consolidate control. He hadn't anticipated a year-long response. He hadn't anticipated patience. He hadn't anticipated that the person he believed broken would redesign the ground beneath him. By the time he realized control was no longer his, there was nothing emotional left to negotiate, only procedures. And procedures, once enacted, do not reverse themselves to spare pride. The confrontation did not happen the way most people imagine these things. There was no explosive revelation, no trembling accusations, no dramatic unveiling of recordings played through speakers. It happened on a gray afternoon in early spring. Our grandfather had asked to see both of us in his study again. The air carried the faint scent of rain through slightly open windows. I could hear the soft ticking of the mantel clock, a steady, indifferent rhythm. Callum arrived tense. His footsteps were firmer than usual, controlled. Our grandfather began simply. "I've completed a final review of the estate and its governance," he said. "Independent oversight will remain permanent. No single trustee will hold unilateral authority." Callum exhaled slowly. "You've made your decision." "Yes." There was a pause, and then Callum turned slightly toward me. I felt it, not through sight, but through attention. The shift in orientation, the weight of expectation. "Did you ask for this?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry. It was searching, measured. I folded my hands lightly in my lap. "I asked for transparency," I replied. Another pause. He chose his next words carefully. "You think I mishandled things?" "I think systems should protect everyone involved," I said calmly, "including you." That unsettled him more than an accusation would have, because I wasn't attacking. I wasn't even labeling. I was positioning. Our grandfather spoke again. "There were inconsistencies that required correction, that's all." Callum's composure thinned slightly. "Inconsistencies don't mean intent." "No," I said gently, "but patterns do." The room went very quiet. He didn't ask what patterns. He didn't ask what I knew. Because in that silence, something became clear to him. I knew enough. Not emotionally, structurally. He tried one last approach. "Isla," he said, softer now. "We went through something traumatic together. You know that." "Yes," I replied. "And you think I would deliberately—" I interrupted him for the first time in a year. "I think," I said evenly, "that choices compound. Not louder, not sharper, just steady." He stopped speaking, because there are moments when denial becomes pointless. Not because you've been exposed publicly, but because the person across from you is no longer persuadable. There was no confession. There didn't need to be. The accident review remained civil. The financial discrepancies remained administrative. Nothing exploded, but the system had already adjusted permanently. Authority redistributed. Oversight embedded. Legal protections codified. Callum's role reduced, not through accusation, but through design. After the meeting, as we walked toward the front hall, he spoke quietly, so our grandfather couldn't hear. "You've changed," he said. "Yes," I answered. "When?" I adjusted my coat, feeling the familiar weight of the brass fountain pen in my pocket. The night I realized silence can be deliberate. He didn't respond, because there was nothing left to argue. Confrontation without heat is unsettling. There's no anger to deflect, no drama to dismiss. The only consequence is standing calmly in the room. And consequently, once standing, doesn't need to raise its voice. It has been 2 years since that spring afternoon. The estate is stable, structured, protected by mechanisms that don't depend on anyone's personality. Callum still exists within the framework, but not above it. Oversight meetings occur quarterly. Reports are audited automatically. Authority is shared between independent trustees and both of us, but no single decision moves without dual confirmation. He no longer narrates the future with certainty. He participates. There is a difference. We do not speak about the accident, not because it's forgotten, but it no longer defines the structure. Civil reviews concluded without public charges. Financial inconsistencies were resolved through repayment and procedural reform. Nothing theatrical, nothing explosive, just documented the correction. Our grandfather passed peacefully last winter. His final letter was read privately. It did not accuse. It emphasized stewardship, integrity, the quiet responsibility of holding what others built. When I held that letter in my hands, tracing the indentation of his signature with my fingertips, I understood something fully for the first time. Power is not dominance. It is designed. I did not restore my sight. That was never part of the story. I live independently now in a different flat, one I chose deliberately. I navigate the city with confidence. I consult part-time on archival risk management, advising institutions on safeguarding fragile assets. There's a certain irony in that, safeguarding fragile assets. People still describe me as calm, gentle, composed. They are not wrong. What has changed is internal. Before the accident, I avoided conflict because I disliked disruption. Now I understand disruption is sometimes necessary, but it must be intentional. I no longer shrink to maintain comfort. I no longer accept roles assigned without consent. And most importantly, I no longer confuse silence with weakness. Silence is a tool. Used passively, it erases you. Used deliberately, it protects you. Callum and I maintain a polite distance. There is no shouting, no dramatic estrangement, just clarity. He once asked me, months after everything settled, "Do you hate me?" "No," I said. And it was true. Hatred would tether me to the moment of betrayal. What I feel instead is understanding. He underestimated me, and in doing so, he revealed himself. That revelation reshaped everything. I'm not the fragile sister, not the invisible one, not the obstacle that could be removed. I am the architect of my own position. And architecture, once reinforced, does not require constant defense. It simply stands. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a final declaration, a moral verdict, a moment where I tell you exactly who was right and who was wrong. But life rarely arranges itself into clean endings. What I learned wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice in the dramatic sense. It was about awareness. There's a quiet danger in being underestimated. It can tempt you to either shrink further or to explode in order to be seen. I did neither. I waited. I documented. I redesigned. And that changed everything. My brother believed that breaking one thing I relied on would break the rest of me. He assumed blindness meant incapacity. He assumed silence meant surrender. But silence can be studied. Calm can be calculated. And patience can outlast ambition. The inheritance was never just about money or property. It was about stewardship, about whether power would sit in the hands of the ego or in the hands of structure. In the end, nothing theatrical happened. No public disgrace. No shouting matches. Just systems that now protect what matters. Sometimes the strongest response isn't to expose someone loudly. It's to remove their ability to do harm, quietly. If there's one thing I would leave you with, it's this. When someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, you don't have to prove them wrong with noise. You can prove them wrong with design. So I'm curious. I'll say that. If you discovered someone had quietly repositioned your life without your consent, would you confront them immediately? Or would you wait and rebuild the ground beneath them first?